The night was colder than usual. A thin wind moved through the city streets, brushing against the empty sidewalks and rattling the loose signs that hung outside closed shops. Street lights flickered softly, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. In the middle of this silence, a man walked slowly, his heavy boots pressing against the concrete with tired rhythm. His name was Daniel Carter. Years ago, Daniel had worn a soldier's uniform. He had once stood tall in faraway lands, with strength in his body and fire in his eyes. But tonight, he was not a soldier. Tonight, he was just another man wandering the streets, carrying a small old duffel bag on his shoulder. His coat was torn, his jeans faded, and his hair unkempt from days without a proper place to rest. Daniel's face looked older than his years. He had lines across his forehead, not only from age but from struggle and survival. His eyes, once sharp and filled with hope, now carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen too much and received too little in return. But despite his worn appearance, there was still a dignity in the way he walked. His steps were slow, yet steady, as if his pride refused to let him bend completely to life's hardships. Across the street stood a tall building with golden lights glowing from every floor. It was the Grand Lexington Hotel, the kind of place that rich travelers chose for comfort. From the outside, it looked like a palace: shiny glass doors, a chandelier sparkling in the lobby, and uniformed staff moving briskly with polite smiles for every guest who walked through. Daniel stopped in front of the hotel and looked up at the glowing sign. His lips pressed together. For hours he had been walking in the cold, searching for somewhere warm, somewhere safe to close his eyes. The shelters were full. Park benches were freezing. He had few coins left, but just enough for the cheapest room. He thought to himself, maybe tonight, they will give me a chance. Pulling the duffel strap higher onto his shoulder, Daniel walked toward the glass doors. As he stepped into the lobby, warm air surrounded him, a sharp contrast to the bitter chill outside. For a moment, his body relaxed. The smell of polished wood, the quiet hum of soft music, the golden light, it all felt far away from the streets. At the reception desk, a young woman in a neat uniform looked up. Her smile was polite but faded quickly when her eyes rested on Daniel's worn coat and rough beard. Her expression stiffened. "Good evening," Daniel said softly, his voice calm and respectful. "Do you have any rooms available for the night?" The receptionist hesitated. She glanced quickly at the monitor, then at Daniel again. Her fingers tapped lightly on the desk. Behind her, a row of shiny keycards hung neatly in order, each one waiting for a guest. Daniel saw them clearly. "We are fully booked," she replied, her tone clipped and professional. Daniel's heart sank. "Please," he said gently, "I only need one room. Just for the night. I can pay." He placed his hand on the counter, showing a few folded bills. They were worn, but they were real. The receptionist's eyes flickered to the money, then back to Daniel's tired face. She lowered her voice, leaning slightly forward. "Sir, I'm sorry. We cannot accommodate you." Daniel straightened slowly. He wasn't a fool. He knew what was happening. She didn't see a paying guest in front of her. She only saw a man with torn clothes, a face unshaven, a bag that looked like it belonged on the side of a road. Behind him, a well-dressed couple entered the lobby, pulling shiny suitcases. The receptionist's face lit up immediately. Her voice grew warm, welcoming, as she greeted them. "Good evening, sir, ma'am. Welcome to the Grand Lexington. Do you have a reservation?" Daniel turned his head and watched. Within minutes, the couple was given a key card, their luggage taken by a smiling bellboy, and they were led toward the elevators. The contrast was sharp, almost painful. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, feeling the sting of rejection. His pride whispered to him not to beg further. His chest tightened, but his face remained calm. Without another word, He picked up his duffel and turned toward the glass doors. As he stepped back into the night, the cold air rushed around him again. He pulled his coat tighter, though it did little to keep him warm. For a brief second, he paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the glowing hotel lobby. Inside, people laughed, carried drinks, and walked across the shining floors. But outside, Daniel walked alone into the darkness. The streets stretched endlessly, the city full of noise yet empty of kindness. Each step reminded him of the distance between who he once was and who the world now saw him as. Once, he was a man others saluted, a man who carried honor. Now, he was a stranger no one wanted to look at. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Daniel carried a quiet flame that refused to die. The rejection hurt, yes. But as he walked farther from the hotel, his jaw tightened. Something in him whispered, "This is not the end. They will see me again. Not like this, but as the man I truly am." And with that silent vow, Daniel disappeared into the night. Daniel walked slowly through the empty streets, his breath forming small clouds in the night air. The city was alive with lights, but for him, it felt hollow. Cars rushed past, their headlights bright, but no one looked at him. People inside were warm, laughing, or heading home. He was outside, unseen, carrying everything he owned in a single worn-out duffel bag. He found a bench under a broken streetlight and sat down. The wooden slats were cold, pressing against his back. He pulled his coat tighter, though the fabric was thin and full of holes. Daniel rubbed his hands together, trying to find warmth, but it was more habit than comfort. As he sat in silence, his thoughts drifted. He remembered a time when his life was different, a time when people didn't avoid his eyes, a time when he wore a uniform that demanded respect. Years ago, Daniel had been a soldier. He had stood in deserts and mountains, in faraway countries most people only heard about on the news. His boots had marched across endless dirt roads, his hands had carried heavy rifles, and his heart had carried the weight of responsibility. He had fought not for medals or recognition, but for his brothers beside him, for the hope of bringing them home safe. He remembered the long nights in tents, the sound of helicopters above, and the letters he wrote to his mother, promising her he was fine. He remembered the silence after battles, when dust filled the air and the world felt broken. But most of all, he remembered the people, the men and women who had stood with him. Some had made it back. Some had not. Daniel's eyes grew heavy as memories filled him. He could still see the faces of those who didn't return. Friends who had laughed with him, shared rations, told stories of home and then were gone in a moment. He carried those faces with him every day. They were ghosts in his heart, silent reminders of the price of service. Back then, when Daniel walked through an airport in uniform, strangers clapped for him. People shook his hand, thanked him for his sacrifice, called him a hero. He had felt proud then, proud to wear his country's colors, proud to be seen. But now, years later, that pride felt like a faded photograph. No one clapped for him anymore. No one thanked him. On the streets, people avoided him. When he asked for a job, employers shook their heads. When he asked for help, they looked away. His service didn't matter. His medals stayed hidden in a small box at the bottom of his duffel, collecting dust, unseen and forgotten. Daniel leaned back against the bench and sighed. His breath rose like smoke in the night. To the world around him, he was just another homeless man, another figure in torn clothes who blended into the background. They didn't see the soldier he once was. They didn't see the sacrifices. They only saw the surface. A group of young people walked past, laughing loudly. One of them glanced at Daniel and quickly looked away. The others didn't even notice him. He might as well have been invisible. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Is this what it all comes down to? He thought. To serve, to give, and then to be forgotten? The wind picked up, brushing against his face. His stomach growled quietly, reminding him he hadn't eaten much that day. He pulled his bag closer and unzipped it, checking the few items inside. A change of clothes, some socks, the old metal box, and a folded photograph of his mother and younger sister. They were smiling in the picture, taken years ago, when life still had hope. He held the photo gently in his hands. His mother had passed away while he was overseas. He hadn't been able to attend her funeral. His sister had her own life now, struggling to survive with her children. He didn't want to be a burden to her. So he stayed silent, drifting through the city on his own. Daniel put the photo back into the bag and closed it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. Around him, the city carried on. Cars honked, people shouted, music played from a nearby bar. Life continued for everyone else, but Daniel felt stuck in time, like he was trapped between who he used to be and who the world now believed he was. Hours passed as he sat on the bench. The night grew colder, but Daniel didn't move. His body was tired, but his mind was restless. Memories kept coming, memories of training camps, of long marches, of promises made to his fellow soldiers. He remembered one of his commanders telling him, "You'll never be invisible. This country will always see you." A bitter smile crossed Daniel's lips. Invisible was exactly what he had become. Still, deep inside, there was a spark that refused to go out. He was tired, yes. He was broken in many ways, yes. But something in him whispered that he was not finished. That his story wasn't meant to end on a cold bench under a broken light. The world didn't see his past. The hotel staff, the strangers on the street, they only saw a man without a home. But Daniel knew who he was, and he knew he could not give up. As the first signs of dawn touched the horizon, Daniel stood slowly from the bench. His body ached, his legs stiff, but he lifted the duffel onto his shoulder once again. Another day was beginning, another chance to keep moving forward. The city might not see him yet. But one day, they would. And with that silent promise, Daniel walked into the early morning light. The sun was rising, spreading a soft golden light over the city. Cars began to fill the roads, and people hurried down sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands, ready for another busy day. Daniel walked among them quietly, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His body ached from sleeping on the cold bench, but he kept moving. He had no clear destination, only the hope of finding something, anything that would make the day easier than the night before. As he crossed a small park, Daniel sat on a bench near a fountain. Children laughed in the distance, playing with a ball, while their parents watched. Office workers hurried past the park on their way to jobs. Daniel lowered his head, not wanting to draw attention. His stomach growled again, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten properly in days. Just then, a young man in his mid-20s walked by. He wore a plain jacket and jeans, carrying a paper bag in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. His hair was messy, as though he had rushed out of his apartment, but his eyes were kind. He noticed Daniel sitting alone, tired and worn out. Most people would have walked past without a second glance, but this man slowed down. He stopped a few steps away and looked at Daniel. For a moment, Daniel felt the same familiar sting. He expected the man to stare with pity or judgment. Instead, the young man gave a small, genuine smile. "Hey," he said softly, holding up the coffee. "You look like you could use this more than me." Daniel blinked, surprised. People rarely offered him anything, especially not warmth in the form of kindness. I don't want to take what's yours," Daniel replied, his voice rough from the cold air. The young man shook his head. "It's okay. I can grab another. Please, take it." Slowly, Daniel reached out. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the cup, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes lowering. The young man sat down on the bench beside him, setting the paper bag between them. "Name's Michael," he said, his tone casual but friendly. "What about you?" Daniel hesitated, unused to strangers asking for his name in kindness. "Daniel," he finally answered. Michael nodded. "Nice to meet you, Daniel." He opened the paper bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in foil. Without asking, he placed it in Daniel's hand. "You should eat. I always buy an extra." "Have it." Daniel stared at the sandwich, then at Michael. His throat tightened. He wanted to refuse out of pride, but hunger won. "You didn't have to, I know," Michael interrupted with a smile. "But I wanted to." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt seen, not as a homeless man, not as someone to ignore, but as a person. He ate slowly, the taste filling his empty stomach, while Michael sat beside him, sipping his second cup of coffee. After a few minutes of silence, Michael asked gently, "So, what's your story?" Daniel paused. Most people didn't care about his story. They only cared about moving past him. But there was something in Michael's tone, something honest, that made Daniel want to answer. "I was a soldier," Daniel began, his voice low. "Served for years. I thought when I came back, things would be better. But, life had other plans. Jobs didn't last. Bills piled up. And here I am." Michael listened carefully, not interrupting. His eyes didn't show pity, only respect. "You served?" Michael asked softly. Daniel nodded. "A long time ago. Doesn't matter much now." "It matters," Michael said firmly. "You gave part of your life for others. That will always matter." Those words hit Daniel hard. It had been so long since anyone reminded him that his service still meant something. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he had to look away, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, Daniel. I volunteer at a veterans center a few blocks from here. They help with food, clothes, even job connections sometimes. You should come by. I think they could do something for you." Daniel shook his head lightly. "I don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be a burden," Michael said quickly. "You'd be part of a community. People there understand. People who've been through the same things. Just, give it a try." Daniel studied Michael's face. The young man was serious, his eyes steady, his voice filled with quiet determination. It wasn't empty kindness. It was real. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was there. Michael stood up and pulled a small card from his pocket, scribbling an address on the back. He handed it to Daniel. "That's the place. If you show up tomorrow, I'll be there. I can introduce you to the team." Daniel held the card carefully, as though it was more valuable than money. I'll think about it," he said softly. Michael smiled and gave a small nod. "That's all I ask. Just think about it." Before leaving, Michael placed a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more comfort than Daniel had felt in years. Then he walked away, blending back into the busy street. Daniel sat on the bench, staring at the card. His fingers traced the ink of the address again and again. The city around him continued to move, people rushing, cars honking, children laughing, but Daniel felt a stillness inside. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. As the morning sun rose higher, Daniel slipped the card into his pocket and whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow will be different." And for the first time in years, he believed it might be true. The next morning came quietly. Daniel woke up on the same bench where he had spent the night. His back ached, and his hands were stiff from the cold. For a moment, he wondered if his meeting with Michael had only been a dream. But when he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small card, the address was still there, written in black ink. He stared at it for a long while. Part of him wanted to throw it away. Another part of him, the part that remembered Michael's steady voice and kind eyes, told him not to. With a deep breath, Daniel stood, picked up his duffel, and began walking toward the address. The Veterans Center was a modest brick building with a flag hanging near the door. It wasn't large or fancy, but there was something warm about it. As Daniel stepped inside, he was met with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. Posters decorated the walls, showing messages of encouragement and photographs of smiling men and women who had once served. Michael was there, just as he had promised. When he saw Daniel, his face lit up with relief. "You made it," he said, walking over and shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "I'm glad you came." Daniel gave a small nod. "I almost didn't." "But you did," Michael replied. "And that's what matters." He introduced Daniel to the staff, who greeted him with genuine warmth. One of them, an older man named Frank, clapped Daniel on the back. "Welcome, brother. You're in good company here." For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he belonged somewhere. The center offered him a hot shower first. Daniel stepped inside the small bathroom, closing the door behind him. As the warm water poured down, he stood still, almost unable to move. It had been so long since he had felt water this clean and this warm on his skin. Dirt and exhaustion seemed to wash away, and for a brief moment, he felt human again. When he stepped out, clean towels and fresh clothes waited for him. The clothes weren't new, but they were neat, folded, and smelled of soap. Daniel put them on slowly, looking at himself in the mirror. His reflection was almost unrecognizable. The man who stared back at him didn't look like the tired figure from the night before. Michael knocked gently and handed him a bag. "We had some donations come in," he said. "There's a suit in here. I thought it might fit you." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "A suit?" Michael smiled. "Yeah. Something for when you're ready to walk back into the world. Trust me, you'll need it." Daniel opened the bag, pulling out a dark suit with a crisp white shirt and a simple tie. He ran his fingers over the fabric, almost in disbelief. It had been years since he'd worn anything like it. His hands trembled slightly as he held it up. Later, with Frank's help, Daniel sat in a chair while someone trimmed his hair and shaved his beard. Every stroke of the razor revealed more of the man he used to be. Slowly, his reflection in the mirror began to change. His jawline appeared again, his eyes looked clearer, and his face seemed younger. He looked less like a ghost of the past and more like a man ready to step into the present. When he finally put on the suit, he paused in front of the mirror. The transformation was almost shocking. The fabric fit him well, the shirt brightened his face, and the tie gave him an air of quiet dignity. Daniel straightened his shoulders, staring at himself. For a long time, he had believed the world only saw a broken man. But in that moment, he saw the soldier he used to be, the man who had once walked proudly through airports, the man his mother would have been proud of. Michael walked in and smiled wide. "Look at you," he said. "I knew that suit would be perfect." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I almost don't recognize myself." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's the point. Sometimes you just need a reminder of who you really are." The center also gave Daniel a hot meal. He sat at a long table with other veterans, listening to their stories. Some were young, some older, but each had faced battles both overseas and at home. They spoke of struggles, jobs lost, families broken, nights spent in shelters, but they also spoke of survival. For the first time in a long time, Daniel laughed quietly at one of their jokes. By the end of the day, Daniel felt a strength he hadn't known in years. He had clothes, a full stomach, and most importantly, he had hope. The mirror had shown him a man he thought was gone forever. Now, that man was standing tall again. As evening came, Michael walked Daniel to the door. "What's next?" Michael asked. Daniel looked down at the suit, then back up with a steady gaze. "I think I need to face the places that turned me away. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I am still somebody." Michael nodded, understanding. "Then do it. Walk back in, not for them, for you." Daniel took a deep breath. The thought of returning to that hotel, of standing in the same lobby that had rejected him, filled him with both fear and determination. But now, he was ready. He wasn't the invisible man they had turned away. He was Daniel Carter, a veteran, a man who still carried dignity in his heart. As he stepped into the cool evening air, the city lights reflected off his suit. People passed him on the sidewalk, but this time, their eyes lingered. Some even nodded politely. For the first time in years, Daniel was not invisible. He walked with purpose, each step stronger than the last. Tomorrow, he would return to the hotel. Tomorrow, they would see him not the broken man of the night before, but the man he truly was. And tomorrow, he would no longer be ignored. The city evening was alive with glowing lights, moving cars, and people rushing to their destinations. But Daniel walked with calm steps, his suit pressed neatly, his shoes polished, and his shoulders straight. The same streets that had made him feel invisible now seemed different. People glanced at him as he passed, not with suspicion, but with quiet respect. Some even gave him polite nods, the kind strangers gave to businessmen or guests on their way to important places. Daniel's heart beat steadily, but inside, a storm was building. Every step took him closer to the Grand Lexington Hotel, the same place that had turned him away not long ago. The memory of the receptionist's cold eyes and sharp words still echoed in his mind. "No vacancies," she had said, though he knew there were plenty of empty rooms. At the time, he had walked away quietly, ashamed and invisible. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was walking back not as a man in torn clothes, but as someone who carried his dignity on the outside as well as the inside. When the tall building came into view, Daniel slowed his pace for a moment. The golden lights glowed across the hotel's glass doors, and the grand chandelier sparkled inside the lobby. For a second, he hesitated. Part of him whispered that he didn't belong, that the suit was only fabric, and the world would still see him as nothing more than a man from the streets. But then he straightened his back. "No," he thought firmly. "This time, they will see me." With measured steps, Daniel crossed the street and approached the glass doors. They opened smoothly as he entered, and warm air greeted him once again. The lobby was just as he remembered: shining marble floors, polished counters, and well-dressed guests moving about. But this time, he did not feel like an intruder. The receptionist looked up as he approached. She was the same young woman who had turned him away. At first, she gave him the usual warm hotel smile reserved for guests. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" Daniel stood tall in front of her, his suit fitting perfectly, his hair trimmed, his face clean-shaven. His voice was steady when he replied, "No, I don't have a reservation. I was hoping to book a room." She quickly tapped at the keyboard and checked her screen. "Of course, sir. We do have several rooms available this evening. Would you prefer a single room or a suite?" The words hit Daniel like a quiet strike to the heart. A few nights ago, she had told him there were no rooms at all. Now, because of the suit, there were several available. He glanced behind her at the row of shiny key cards, hanging just as they had before. For a brief moment, Daniel said nothing. He simply studied her face. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another paying guest in neat clothes. The sting of that realization cut deep. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "Not long ago, I came here and asked the same question. I asked for a room. But I was told there were none available." The receptionist froze, her fingers pausing above the keyboard. She looked at him more closely now. There was something in his eyes, something steady and unshaken. Her face paled slightly as recognition flickered in her mind. Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. "That night, I was wearing a torn coat and carrying this same bag." He lifted his old duffel slightly from his side. "I was the same man then as I am now. The only difference is the suit." The lobby grew quieter. A couple standing nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. The receptionist opened her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel did not raise his voice, nor did he show anger. Instead, he spoke with dignity, each word steady. "You told me there were no vacancies. But I could see the empty keys behind you. You didn't see me as a guest. You only saw the outside." The silence stretched for a moment. Finally, the receptionist lowered her eyes, her face red with shame. Daniel took a deep breath. For a moment, he considered turning around and walking away, proving that he didn't need their approval. But then, he thought of Michael, of the veterans at the center, of the promise he made to himself to be seen again, not as invisible, but as a man who still mattered. "I would like to book a single room for tonight," he said calmly. The receptionist nodded quickly, her voice shaky now. "Why yes, sir. Right away." She handed him a key card, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel accepted it without another word. He could feel the stares of a few guests around him, but he kept his expression calm. Walking toward the elevator, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced rejection but refused to let it define him. When he entered the room, Daniel set his duffel on the neatly made bed. He looked around at the soft lighting, the clean sheets, the polished furniture. It wasn't the luxury that mattered. It was the fact that he had walked back into the same place that once turned him away, and this time, he had been recognized as worthy. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the large window. The city stretched out before him, its lights sparkling against the night sky. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Not because of the room, but because he had taken a step forward. This was not about proving the hotel staff wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was not invisible. He was still Daniel Carter, a man who had served, a man who had survived, a man who still carried dignity no matter what the world chose to see. As he leaned back against the pillows, a small smile touched his lips. The battle was far from over, but tonight, in this quiet room, he had won something important. He had won back himself. The next morning, sunlight poured gently through the curtains of the hotel room. Daniel woke slowly, almost forgetting for a moment where he was. The soft bed beneath him, the quiet hum of the heater, the smell of fresh linens, it felt almost unreal. For years, he had lived without such comfort. And now, here he was, sitting in a place that only yesterday had been denied to him. He sat up, ran a hand across his face, and thought about the receptionist. The look on her face when she realized who he was still lingered in his mind. She had seen him differently last night, but not because he had changed as a man, only because of the clothes on his back. That truth cut deep, but it also gave him strength. Daniel dressed carefully, tying the knot of his tie with steady hands. He looked in the mirror once more. The man staring back at him was sharp, composed, and dignified. But Daniel knew the suit did not define him. What defined him was his story, the journey from soldier to forgotten, and now to someone who refused to stay invisible. He picked up his old duffel bag and walked out of the room. The elevator carried him down to the lobby, where the morning rush had begun. Guests checked out, staff hurried between tasks, and the sound of rolling suitcases echoed against the marble floor. Daniel stepped forward, his presence calm yet firm. He walked back to the same reception desk. The same young woman was there, typing quickly on her keyboard. When she looked up and saw him, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Good morning, sir," she said quickly, her voice polite but nervous. Daniel held her gaze. For a long moment, the world around them seemed to slow. Then, with steady words, he spoke. "Do you remember me?" The receptionist froze. She glanced at him, then away, then back again. I think so," she admitted softly. Daniel nodded. "A few nights ago, I stood right here. I asked you for a room. You told me there were no vacancies. But last night, when I came back in this suit, suddenly there were several rooms available. Why is that?" Her hands trembled slightly on the desk. "Sir." Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not accuse with anger. Instead, he spoke with quiet power. "I am the same man. The only thing that changed was the suit. The man who asked for a room that night is the same man standing before you now. Yet one of us you ignored, and the other you welcomed." A silence spread across the lobby. People nearby turned their heads, listening. A businessman with a briefcase paused mid-step. A family waiting with their luggage fell quiet. Even the staff behind the counter looked up. The receptionist's cheeks burned. She lowered her eyes, ashamed, unable to respond. Daniel let the silence speak for a moment before he continued. "I was once a soldier. I wore a uniform, not a suit. And in that uniform, strangers shook my hand, thanked me, called me a hero. But when I returned home, without the uniform, I became invisible. I became someone you couldn't even give a room to." His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Guests in the lobby shifted uncomfortably, realizing the truth in them. Daniel placed his duffel bag gently on the counter. "This bag holds my past. It holds medals, photographs, memories of the life I gave to serve others. You didn't see that. You only saw torn clothes. You only saw what was on the outside." The receptionist's eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. Daniel gave a slow nod. "Maybe you are. But let this be a lesson. The next time you see someone who doesn't look like the rest of your guests, remember this moment. Remember that worth is not measured by suits, or ties, or money. Sometimes, the people you turn away carry stories you cannot imagine." The words settled in the room like heavy stones. The businessman lowered his eyes. The family shifted uncomfortably. Even the other staff members stood quietly, taking in every word. Daniel did not stay longer. He picked up his bag and gave a final nod. "Thank you for the room," he said softly. "But more importantly, thank you for reminding me who I am. I am not invisible. I am still here." With that, he turned and walked toward the glass doors. The lobby remained silent behind him. As Daniel stepped outside, the city air greeted him again. It was cool but refreshing. He inhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift off his chest. The reveal had not been about revenge or humiliation, it had been about truth. He had spoken not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unseen, ignored, or turned away. Walking down the street, Daniel felt lighter. He wasn't just a man in a suit, he was a man who had faced rejection, carried scars, and still stood tall. He thought of Michael, of the veterans at the center, of the kind words that had pushed him toward this moment. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't just feel seen. He felt heard. And as he walked into the morning light, he carried with him a quiet certainty: the world could no longer define him by appearances. He had revealed the truth not only to the hotel, but to himself. The city had begun to settle into a gentle afternoon rhythm. Streets were full of movement, but Daniel walked with a quiet purpose. His suit was still neat, his shoes polished, and his posture straight. Today, he carried no duffel bag, only the weight of his story and the confidence of a man who had reclaimed his place in the world. Daniel had spent the morning at the Veterans Center, reconnecting with the people who had helped him rediscover himself. Michael had been there, smiling and supportive, guiding him through conversations about new opportunities and ways to regain stability. Daniel felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. These people saw him for who he was, not for his clothes or his circumstances. But now, Daniel had something else to do. He needed to close the circle. The hotel, the place that had once turned him away, still held a memory that lingered. Not out of anger, but out of purpose. He wanted to show, quietly, that dignity and respect could not be ignored forever. As he approached the Grand Lexington Hotel, he felt a small flutter of nerves. It wasn't fear, he had faced too much for that, but anticipation. What he carried wasn't a demand for acknowledgement, it was the quiet strength of a man who had walked through hardship and come out standing. When he entered the lobby, he noticed the same receptionist behind the desk. She looked up, slightly startled, as if she recognized him but couldn't place why. Daniel offered her a calm, measured smile. "Good afternoon," he said softly. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied, her voice polite but tinged with unease. Daniel nodded. "I just wanted to stop by, not to make a scene, but to thank you." The receptionist blinked, confused. "Thank me?" "Yes," Daniel continued. "A few nights ago, you refused me a room. It hurt, yes. But it reminded me of something important: who I am, and who I am not willing to let the world make me believe I am. I wanted you to see me, truly. And now, I hope you understand." Her hands rested lightly on the counter, her face pale with realization. I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "I didn't see. I didn't understand." Daniel nodded slowly. "You didn't see the uniform, and you didn't see the story. But now, maybe you do. And that's enough. No one should be judged by the outside alone." The lobby was quiet. Guests paused briefly, sensing the weight in his words. Some looked curious, some thoughtful, but none judged. Daniel's presence carried an unspoken authority. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding acknowledgement. He was simply being himself, and that alone commanded respect. He paused for a moment, looking around at the polished floor, the golden lights, and the sparkling chandelier. This place had once been a symbol of rejection. Now, it felt different. It felt like a mirror reflecting the truth: the world often sees only what is on the surface, but those who persevere carry a deeper light that cannot be hidden. Turning back to the receptionist, Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't need anything from you. Just remember what you saw today. Let it guide how you see others in the future." The young woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I will, sir. I promise." Daniel gave a small nod of thanks and turned to leave. Every step he took carried the quiet pride of someone who had faced rejection, endured hardship, and reclaimed his dignity. As he passed through the lobby, a few guests glanced at him, some nodding politely. He returned each acknowledgement with a calm smile. Outside, the city air felt fresh, warm against his face. Daniel paused for a moment on the steps, looking up at the sky. The sun hung bright, scattering light across the buildings and streets. It was a simple moment, but for him, it was profound. He thought of Michael and the Veterans Center, of the people who had helped him remember that worth is not measured by appearances. He thought of the nights spent on benches, the cold streets, and the feeling of invisibility that had haunted him for so long. And he realized something powerful: he had survived it all. He had taken the invisible and made himself seen, not through anger or revenge, but through dignity, patience, and perseverance. Daniel took a deep breath and continued walking. He had no specific destination, no grand announcement to make, no audience to impress. What mattered now was that he had found his place again, not in the eyes of others, but in his own heart. As he moved through the city streets, Daniel's steps were lighter. The world might still judge quickly, still look at the surface before the depth, but he had learned something that could never be taken away: his value was his own. And that knowledge carried a quiet power stronger than any suit, any hotel room, or any polite nod. He passed a small cafe, where children laughed and couples shared coffee. A woman dropped a coin near a busker, and a man held the door for a stranger. Life moved in small gestures, some unnoticed, some profound. Daniel understood now that every person carried a story like his, some hidden beneath the surface. And in his journey, he had learned to honor those stories not with judgment, but with understanding. As the afternoon sun settled, Daniel paused on a quiet street corner. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth touch his face. A small smile curved his lips. He had walked from rejection to recognition, from invisibility to dignity. And the journey was not over, but the most important step had been taken: he had reclaimed himself. Daniel Carter, the soldier, the survivor, the man who had once been ignored and turned away, now moved forward with quiet strength. He carried no anger, only the certainty that life's trials did not define him. His past was honored, his present reclaimed, and his future wide open. And as he walked into the bustling city, he was ready for whatever came next, seen, respected, and finally at peace with who he was.